Zero no Kiseki and Ao no Kiseki are the 4th and 5th games in the Kiseki series, otherwise known as the Trails of series in the West. Unfortunately, these 2 games were never picked up by any localization publishers in the West. The next Trails games to be released after 3rd chapter was the 6th game in the series, Trails of Cold Steel. It's understandable why they would have skipped Zero and Ao since the PSP didn't do too well in the West and the sales of 3rd chapters were only about 20 to 50,000 sales, according to the data shown on Steam Spy. However, the lack of the Western release doesn't mean you should skip this arc entirely. If you're not already aware, fan translations are available for both games. It's been over 8 years since Zero was ported to the PC, and these translations have come a long way since the first iterations. That said, they still need a lot of work, but seeing as how they're free, I can't really fault the translators. In fact, I would like to take a brief moment to give thanks to everyone who worked hard on releasing the translations. I know how much work and dedication goes into a project like this since JRPGs have insane amounts of text in them. So really, thanks for all the hard work that you guys put into this. As for the actual available versions, I'll post a link to the blogs of the translators and a Reddit post that will be helpful. There are a few versions available since Zero and Ao were released on multiple platforms and multiple languages. I will specifically be focusing on Gurren and his team's translation that was released in 2018, as this was the one I used for both Zero and Ao. I also know of another group working on it called the Geofront, whose work also looks very promising. They finished the rough translations for Zero, but they have only completed about 75% of their edits as of this video. As for Ao, they have no announcement on their webpage if they're going to start on it next, but according to a Receptura forum post, they are. As I've said before, the translations have come a long way, but there are still a few awkward sentences or phrases, in addition to character name translations that probably aren't too accurate. There are specific examples with the sentence structure, but they contain spoilers, so I can't really show you. However, in Zero, they do translate honorifics a little too literally. For example, they would translate Cecile Nesan as Sister Cecile, which I'm pretty sure no one speaks in that fashion. Or they would add Mr. or Miss when using the San honorifics. It looked like that was fixed in Ao though. That said, even though there are some rough spots, the overarching experience and intent of the scene and dialogues can be interpreted pretty easily. Most of the game can be read perfectly fine. Although if you're really uptight about the translations, you can wait for patches or learn Japanese yourself. Personally, I was able to play through the game without thinking about it too much, and I think most people should be able to as well. If you aren't bothered by the translations, then great. Before I start talking about the gameplay though, I'm going to assume everyone has played the Sky games. So I will omit a lot of specific detail since 90% of the game structure is the same. And if you haven't played the Sky games, you should definitely do that first before considering playing Zero and Ao. Don't say I didn't warn you. Alright, let's talk about combat first. Zero and Ao both contain new features and balance changes that improves on the combat. It took me a little bit to get adjusted to the new requirements, the costs, and elemental changes, such as Latir now being called Breath and is a wind spell, but the combat is the same as from the Sky games. Combat takes place on a grid using the same turn-based system with certain actions having specific delays, which the game now shows you. Spells and courts also have been modified in some regards, so some spells, usually the lower tiers like Earthwall, have been removed since the higher tier spells were the ones you were using anyway. Team attacks have also been added to the turn bar, allowing for all characters to perform an AoE attack, kind of like Persona 5's all-out attack. There are some additional minor changes as well, but you can see those for yourself when you play. My only complaint about Zero and Ao is that they're much easier on Nightmare than the Sky games were. But this is very minor and I'm sure most people won't care about this. Gameplay outside of combat also follows the same gameplay loop as Trails in the Sky, so it should be very familiar to you. You have requests that can be done or ignored, but the urgent ones will advance the story. There will also be secret quests that aren't posted either, so you have to talk to everyone if you're not following a guide. In terms of the size of the explorable region, I find it to be smaller than the first or second chapter, but larger than the third chapter. I still easily spent over 60 hours completing Zero and 70 completing Ao. I also didn't mind backtracking, something I did a lot of, since there were a lot of ways of fast traveling within the main hub of Crossbell and the world in general. Despite having a smaller map, the content of the game is still rich and exploration was still fun. What really separates the Trails games from the rest of the JRPGs you might find is the amazing world building and story. Zero and Owl are no exception, and it's why you shouldn't skip on these games. The story follows Lloyd, Ellie, Tio, and Randy, who are in a special department within the police department of Crossbell. With many goals to achieve and obstacles to overcome, their touching journey is one to remember. Though they do follow some cliche traits like Lloyd being ignorant of his charm on the female characters, or Randy being an actual outward playboy, I don't mind these types of characters. The cast is interesting by themselves, but the twists and turns and the people they meet is what really makes this game memorable and worth playing through. All the side quests also helped develop the side characters to support the world building. Everyone has a role to play in the overall story, even if their roles are minor, and these side quests help set their place in the world. Though some of the character dialogue, not the translations, and the scenes did bother me a bit, but it's kinda par for the course for JRPGs. Firstly, too much giggling. There was one scene where literally 4 sentences in the conversation started with giggles back to back. I don't think anyone giggles this much in conversations, but they did it. But this was something that was easy to ignore since I did go through dialogues pretty fast. The other fault, which will probably bother more people, is the sexualization and innuendos against female characters found throughout both games, such as some breast fondling or the guys drooling over the ladies' swimsuits. While this is easy for me to ignore since it was sprinkled across the game, I did notice it, and sometimes I just think, that's not really appropriate. I think none of these issues should deter you from an otherwise phenomenal game, but these were the thoughts I had when playing through them. In a game that does everything so well, the soundtrack is no exception and keeps to the standard of Falcom games. I don't know how these guys do it, but my god, they make some of the best soundtracks I hear in gaming. All of the tracks in Zero and Owl are simply breathtaking. They all fit the situations they're played in. Sometimes I even just sit on the title screen just to listen to the opening theme. There is a nice cheerful song in town which makes doing all my shopping and exploring more enjoyable. There is a lot of dialogue and NPC interaction in this game, so having a nice melody to listen to really makes things more enjoyable. Sad moments were also tear-jerking because it was accompanied by a relatable song. I'm not a person who really cries, but my eyes got a bit watery many times. As simply amazing as this game is, there are a few caveats I should mention. Setting up the game will probably be the most annoying part, but that shouldn't take too long. Zero and Owl lack a turbo button, although the readme did say it had one, but it didn't work for me. And if you played a Trails game after using turbo, you really can't go back. So I downloaded Cheat Engine and used a speed hack, which worked surprisingly well. It did cause some crashes when playing Owl whenever a Master Quartz would level up, but it only happened like 3 times, so not a big deal for me. I also like to use a controller, so I have DS4 mapping all the keys to buttons I want. Problem is, key buttons aren't translated and are basically question marks or something illegible, so I had to do some trial and error to get the setup how I wanted. But after all this is done, it was smooth sailing. Just something to keep in mind for those who don't like to troubleshoot or thought there wouldn't be any setup required. So basically what you should leave here with is, don't skip out on these 2 games. If you're in the same boat as I was and finished the Sky series and was about to jump straight into the Cold Steel series, just stop. Take a moment to look at Zero and Owl. It will be worth it in the end, I promise. The Crossbell arc is considered the best arc, compared to Liberal at least, by most fans of the Kiseki series, and after playing it, I can see why. I definitely enjoyed the storytelling and the setting more than I did with Sky, especially since one of the loose ends from Sky was resolved in Zero. But they're all fantastic games. And just in case, if you haven't played any of the Kiseki games but are a huge fan of JRPGs, do yourself a big favor and start with Trails in the Sky first chapter and work your way through. It's a lot of work, but I guarantee you, it will satisfy that itch for an amazing JRPG. At least it's not as bad as trying to start fresh with Kingdom Hearts, right?